Hello and welcome. In this video, I want to talk about the task of validating email input in a job that we're building in RackForms. There's a lot to this type of job, and I will actually caution right up front that one of the big problems or issues that we're going to have with something like this is security. Specifically, whenever we try to validate things like email, and we're going to create essentially a binary yes, you can register an account, or no, you can't because an email exists or doesn't. We essentially create a system that can be exploited because somebody can then just find out your email user list by just trying a bunch of emails and running them through your system. And if you don't put in things like limitations and whatnot, you can run into security issues. And so I'm mostly going to avoid that here just because I want to talk about the specific theory and technology as it relates to RackForms. But please do keep that in mind, that if you do build a system like this, if you're going to take the step to validate an email, you really need to think about the security implications of doing so. But that said, let's just kind of take a look at it. So how would I validate email against this FB demo table? Now, FB demo is important because this is a table that's included with every copy of RackForms. So if you have RackForms installed, you have this FB_demo table. And I have a bunch of sample data in here. And speaking of sample, I have like this email sample@yahoo.com. So let's say I'm creating a system here that I want to make sure will not allow the user to submit the form if this particular email address exists. Here's how I'd set something like that up. I'd go ahead and I would create a fresh job in RackForms, and I would call it something like validate email. And then what I would do is I would create 2 form pages and then optionally my submission page. Now I'm assuming that you want to submit this data through, though this could technically be going to some other type of system. But in this particular case, the first page is to enter the email, the second page is to validate email, and then the third page is just to submit email. So we'll just kind of concentrate on those first 2 pages, but just know that this is what we would eventually go to if the email is good. So how do we do this? Well, of course, we need a field that we would enter the email value. So I'd have email and I'd have submit. Because I have these multiple pages here, when I click submit right here, I'm going to be going to this page. And so this is where I want to perform a lookup on my database to see if my email value exists. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a query module to this page, to the second page here. So let me select the second page and add the query module. And I'm simply going to say select count and then star as CT from FB demo where email equals, that is this column right here, email equals the value that I'm passing in. Now the value that I'm passing in is going to be the form field email. So I use my dynamic variable picker here and just say, I want you to query the database, query that email, and then I want you to grab the count as a field called CT from FB demo. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down to this code to run after query right here, and I'm going to act on my logic. So I'm going to say, just by copying and pasting this right here, if FB query 0 CT, because that's the name of my field, is equal to 0, actually we'll say not equal to 0, then we're going to go ahead and issue a PHP header command. So this, and we're going to say location index.php, and then we're going to exit with a code of 0. So what does this actually mean? Well, I'm going to redirect to a page called index, so I need to rename this guy so that it actually matches that. And we're simply going to say if we run this query right here, select count as CT from FB demo where email equals some value. And let me just show you real quick what that query would actually look like if I put in a value here. So let's say 1, and then run this query. And if I have an email, actually that's a little bit, okay, I do have an email called 1 right there. That was a little bit unexpected. But because I have a field email and it has an entry of 1 and I have a count of 1 for that, I'm going to get a 1 right here. If I have a value that doesn't exist like this, I'm going to get a count of 0. So the CT column right here is simply going to say, I'm going to either equal 0 or not 0. And so if it's not 0, that means we have an existing record already, and I'm going to redirect back to index.php. Now, I do need to tell the user that there was a problem with my email field. So to do that, I'm going to add just a real quick query string to this, and I'm going to say go back to index.php and I'm going to say error equals email. So this query string right here, error, is going to be a get string that's going to have a value of email. So then I'll go into my block right here, I'll add a code block, and I'll simply put that above the email field, and I'll say, with PHP code here, I'll say if is set $get, and then that name of that field, error, and $get error equals email. Then we're going to go ahead and print out a string. So I'm just going to say echo, and by the way, you could do this, you could echo out a full div, but I'm just going to say email already exists. Maybe I'll say error email already exists. So if I have a query string called error, and error is equal to email, I'm going to print out that message. Now notice if it's not equal to email, but like email 1, it doesn't show. So it has to be that email value, but of course we're setting that up right here. So I'm saying index.php, query string of error, and it has a value of email. So let's try this out. So let's go ahead and enter that 1 and hit submit. And I go to page 1 right here. So let's go ahead and double check my query. So I have FB query, though I think this actually is going to be updated to the name of my field, which is actually Q1. So let me just make sure that looks good. So there we go. So now the email already exists. So I'm going to show this page. Now, if the email doesn't exist, again, just some random value, then I should get to the validate email page. And at this point, if the email does exist and I don't want to do extra processing, I would actually just issue a second redirect to submission.php. So if I don't care that the user actually sees this page, I'd actually go into the query module itself and I'd say else, just go ahead and redirect to that page. So let me copy this, paste it in, and say, yep, you just go to submission.php. And this way, we're essentially saying we don't really care what happens here if we don't have the email. We just want to validate the email, so the user is technically not even going to see this page. So now if I submit this through, I should go to the submission.php page. And by the way, it may have, yep, so I'm not actually requiring this page, so I actually need to check this guy, page not required, because we're actually using this as a processing page. So I'll click submit, and now we go to submit email. So let's just do a quick review of what we all did in this job right here. So I needed to validate email. So the first thing I did is I entered an email field, and when we click submit, we go to a validate email page. I then have a query module which performs a count query against that value, and then we process it down here. We essentially say, if the query that we just ran has that CT field that's not equal to 0, that is, it could be 4 instances of the email, assumably it'd only be 1, but it could be some other value. But essentially, if it's not 0, then we're going to redirect back to the index page. The index page then uses a query string, in this case error equals email, to essentially trigger this block to display if we have come from this particular value. And of course the idea here would be that if we don't actually get an error in this way, we'll never see this block of code. Otherwise, we're going to redirect to the submission.php page. The submission.php page then is simply a confirmation page. This is where we'd probably have like our SQL plus item or an email item, presumably that would then process our values through. Finally, we had to, because we're just using this as a processing page and not actually submitting it, I did need to check page not required allow direct access right here, because user's not actually physically pressing a submit button on this page, which means that RackForms doesn't know that this page can be skipped. So we have to tell RackForms that the page can be skipped explicitly. Now that said, if we truly are creating an account creation screen, what I probably would want to do is actually use this page as a validation page. So I would actually say, here new user, here's the values that we're going to go ahead and assign to this account. If you click submit, we'll add a new account, etc., etc. So that's personally what I would do. But again, in this case, I simply set up so that I say, if you succeed this query, we're just going to automatically redirect to the submission page. So that is how I would perform email logic in my form. Now again, the last thing I would point out is that this system right here does not at all account for somebody flooding this with requests, right? We don't actually look at the IP address of who's actually submitting this and say, well, you've submitted more than 5 entries in the last 10 minutes, so you can't submit any more. You need to set that up if you do this on your own, because again, somebody could just hit this page over and over again with random values, and they could, in essence, get all the email addresses from your system. Of course, the bad part there is if they know the email address of your registered users, then they could do things like try to spoof your password reminder system, etc. So you definitely would want to protect that from floods. That said, though, so long as you set that up, this should be a very effective way of grabbing a validation for an email field.